You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 81. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Today we want to continue our conversation about the value of celebration. If you'll remember, last episode we were talking about celebration in the hard times, but actually focusing upon experiencing God in situations and circumstances and in the people around us, and keeping focused upon the presence of God in the people around us. And today we want to continue that conversation. We've got a couple of questions we might ask ourselves and then turn around and ask you. So Sarah, as we start this episode, where have you seen God recently?
Well, do you want to hear about chocolate chip cookies, about the abundance of women who are pregnant, about handshakes and welcome, or...
So you've been experiencing God in lots of different ways and lots of different people.
Yeah, let's go with the handshake and welcome. The other one that I was going to say, or pastors who are in the midst of transition. But let's go with the handshakes and welcome. So I was attending a couple of days ago. I was attending a leadership conference, and I had never been to this local church that it was being hosted at. And so I'm listening to Google, tell me it's a half a mile away, a quarter mile away on my right. And then I noticed that I don't have to pay attention to Google any longer, because standing out at the road are a couple of people who are literally dancing on the street. And I kind of laugh because I would never do anything like that. And so I just smile when people are so outgoing that they're willing to celebrate people pulling into their parking lot. And, they had on the yellow, construction vests, and you knew that what they were doing, they were directing people in. And from the two individuals that were out at the road, they directed us to another individual who told us which aisle to turn down. And all of them have huge grins on their face and are saying good morning and welcome and waving their hands. But I get out of my car to walk to the entrance, and this church had 3 or 4 different buildings. And so they were trying to help folks know which building to go into. And they had a whole team of people who were standing outside greeting folks. And I intentionally slowed down because I wanted to check and see if what I was observing was actually true. Because what I was noticing was they didn't miss a single person walking through the door. And it wasn't just the casual, hello, good morning, how are you? It was reaching out your hand. The gentleman who greeted me reached out his hand. He said, good morning, welcome. We're so glad you're here. My name's Mike. Let me help you get checked in. And he escorted me to the table that I needed to go to check in. And they did that with everyone. And I thought, what a beautiful welcome. 3 days later, I still remember the guy's name was Mike, because he made such an impression on me of the way that he was genuinely excited and genuinely cared about the people that were there. I could tell it wasn't just a job that he had been asked to do. He cared that there were people who were coming to experience the same thing that he was going to get to experience. And truly, it set the whole tone for the entire day. And I won't go into the details of that day, but that day for me spiraled out of control. But it started in a really good way of reminding me of how God relates to us and invites us into his presence. So a little bit of a meta conversation there about where did I see and experience God's presence? It was in and through other people embodying God's presence to me and for me. That's where I have experienced God. So Tim, where have you experienced God?
It happens all the time. I think I've gotten to a place now that when it happens, I experience it, I make note of it and go on. And so when I try to think of times like we're doing right now, um, some of those things don't come back as quickly. I could tell you about a loan officer at a bank where I experienced the grace of God, or I could tell you that in the district I've got some churches that are struggling to the point of that if we don't help them some way or another, we're going to have to celebrate their legacy and how their ministry comes to an end. One of the ways that I've tried to do that is to have churches that may have a few more resources and a focus and mission to come alongside some of those churches. And one particular situation where we've had a church where there's some significant ministry that's gone on in the past and just hanging on, I asked a church to come alongside them and to see if there was a way in which we could continue some ministry there. This larger church that's coming alongside them has had some focus on the denominational issues. And so there's been conversation around what's going to happen, what are they going to do. There are people who are trying to decide whether they're going to stay as United Methodists or not. But here's where I saw God in the midst of this. As this larger church came alongside the smaller church and they began to assess the ministry, people who were in the larger church began to come alongside, and they have found their a new identity in terms of mission, coming alongside not only for worship, but for a free store, feeding people, working with children, having multi-ethnic worship services. And what I heard and where I experienced God in the midst of that is that I had the pastor report to me, we've gotten so involved in mission in another part of the city with this church, we're not having the conversation around the denominational issues any longer. Dawned on me, and for me, being able to see God at work in the midst of a refocus upon what's important. We talked about that last episode about being focused upon the presence of God. And so here I see that happening in a concrete kind of way.
So the question for those of you listening is, how are you celebrating God's presence? Or where have you seen God's presence today? Today, we want to focus on the value of celebration and give you a few questions and a few conversations that you may need to have with people to help set up a culture that values celebrating God's presence. Before we jump into that, let me remind you that this episode of LeaderCast is brought to you by Dare to Lead, a training experience for Christian leaders to learn the skills you need to be a brave leader and create a courageous culture at church, at home, and in the workplace. It's just one way that we're helping you as a leader to transform your relationship with Christ, your congregation, and your local community. You can find these resources for this episode and a place to sign up for Dare to Lead at transformingmission.org/081. On that same page, you'll find a place that you can also become a LeaderCast insider and become the first to know when a new episode drops and get any resources that are associated with that episode without having to fill out another form. And we'd also like to remind you that you can subscribe to LeaderCast on your favorite podcast player. You can find all of those notes transformingmission.org/081. So now, the value of celebration.
So let me ask you a question as we move into celebration.
Okay.
I think we talked about it last episode too, but what do we mean by celebration?
It means what we did to start this episode. Really, that's a vague way to answer the question, but celebration, when we're talking about celebration, what we're really pointing people to is recognizing God's presence in everyday life and in the lives of the people around you. It's asking that question, where have you witnessed God today? Where have you seen God today? How do you celebrate God's presence in the midst of your daily life?
You have a pattern for celebrating God's presence, recognizing God's presence. You do that on a daily basis.
Yeah, for me, it's about reading the scripture and having the scripture ask a question that I'm then paying attention to in my life, and then at the end of the day, reflecting on that. So it may be a daily, a weekly, an annual rhythm that you're pausing to ask yourself, what is God doing, and how do I get to be a part of what God is doing? And so for me, that's my individual practice, but celebration is found in authentic community where we can be our real selves with God and in the presence of one another. It's found where we receive the acceptance from others that we often fail to provide to ourselves, as well as a place where we can embrace the challenges to move beyond where we're at in the present moment.
So the value of I like that. So the value of celebration is found in relationships within the community.
Yes.
It helps us become free, strong, and mature in our faith. At times it means to take, and this is the part about leadership that I particularly like, although I find it difficult at times. It means sometimes we take people by the hand and walk them, help them learn to walk again or to love again or develop healthy relationships again, all by keeping focused upon the presence of God in our lives or in the life of the community.
If you are hearing us talk a lot about relationships, and we said that we were going to be talking about celebration, let me make a statement that may sound silly, but it's true. Most of us don't celebrate because there isn't a connection. There isn't a relationship that we know what to celebrate. So we want to walk through 5 conversations that we hope you will begin to have to set up a culture of celebration in your local congregation. These 5 conversations are adapted from something that Gallup has offered as a resource, and it helps not only with individual relationships, but with staying focused on your organizational purpose and on your mission.
So if you're saying there are 5 conversations, where would you start? What's the first one?
So the first place that I would start is think about the leaders in your local church. So who's the core team of people that you lean on for leadership, not simply because you like them, but because they are the leaders who are helping you to lead the entire congregation towards the mission. So first you've got to identify who those people are. Who are your leaders and who's the team that you are working closely with? In congregations where you have staff, it's going to be your staff. For most of our congregations, they're run as a volunteer organization, and there may be a part-time administrative assistant, but beyond that, there's not staff. So that's why I'm asking you to think about who are the leaders. And that first conversation with them is really about understanding that leader's talents and strengths and who God has created them to be and how their talents and strengths aligns with the needs of the church and their leadership role. So you hear everything that I put into that. It's about knowing who they are and understanding their strengths, and then building that bridge and partnering that with the overall mission. That's the first conversation that you're having. So it's not that Tim has, I'm going to literally use your strengths, Tim. Tim has his 2 top strengths are strategic and futuristic. So because Tim has those 2 talents, we need to place him on a visioning team. That could be one way that Tim uses his strengths. But the reality is, right now, what is happening in the life of the local church, that this is a made-up church that I'm talking about now, is we need Tim to focus his talents and use his talents to help a ministry of a small group be strategic about how they're going to roll out that ministry to a new group of people. And so I'm having a conversation with Tim about how that ministry of small groups fits in with the overall mission of the church, and how the talents and giftedness that he has can contribute to that. So we're talking about who you are and aligning with the overall direction of the organization. And you're also talking about, how are you going to measure success? Now, the easy one, and the example that I just gave is that we usually use to measure is, well, how many people participated? And I would challenge you, think differently, because all that's measuring is the number of widgets that are moving from one place to the next. It doesn't measure transformation. So it might be that you decide, what we're going to do is we're going to ask everybody who participates in the small group in this season to do a 5-question assessment about where they are at the beginning and where they are at the end. Because what we really want to measure is what's the transformation that people have experienced in the midst of that. So you're having this conversation to really set the foundation of what is happening. And if there's something in that conversation that, as a leader, you recognize one of your leaders either doesn't have the capacity or the skills for something, that's also where you're helping them to identify who are the people they need to partner with, or what are the resources that you need to bring alongside them so that they can be successful in what they're doing. So this first conversation is really all about establishing the relationship and getting to know who another person is. And even as I say that, I think about the number of conversations that I have had with clergy who have said, well, I'm just going to tell them what I need them to do. Notice I didn't start there. I started with you listening to someone else's story and their giftedness so that you can help them get connected with the mission and lead in a way that will direct them and connect them to that in appropriate ways that are life-giving for them.
Starting with context and relationship, and how you can best, as you develop the relationship, best use the gifts and the strengths of people to help move in the direction you want to go.
Yes. And that may have sounded like a lot to happen all in one conversation, but that conversation can happen in no longer than 45 minutes to an hour. You just need to be intentional and let the people know that you're meeting with that here's what we're going to talk about, because some people are going to need some time to reflect on some of the questions that you might have.
Another conversation you might have is still based upon those relationships and the direction you're going. So what would be a second one?
So the second one is really, once you have that information, you need to keep it going. And so how are you making the quick connections every week? So, and I mean quick. So this is a 1 to 5 minute conversation. This is a touch point. So it might happen on an email. It might happen on a phone call. If it's with staff, it might simply be passing one another in the hallway and a check-in. This is a place to say, how are things going? I'm just going to keep playing with the example of what I said. Tim's starting small groups. Tim, how are you doing with what we talked about with small groups? Any updates, anything you're having trouble with, anything that I need to know? That's all that it is. So that you can give timely feedback. It's a place that you can stop and celebrate that person for what you have experienced them doing and how they're using their giftedness. And also it's a place that as a leader, you can help get things out of the way if they're getting in the way, or help them to identify people that need to come alongside them. But this is just a quick check-in, touch point. Again, it can be an email, it can be a phone call, might even be a text message.
What I hear in this era is that you're also developing and maintaining a healthy relationship.
So I'm gonna put you on the spot here, Tim, because I know that you have been doing this. We've had some pastors move in our district, and you've made phone calls to folks just to check in. How you doing? Everything okay? That's all that it is. Now, my guess, knowing you, I'm not saying you're long-winded, but I'm just guessing those conversations were probably longer than 1 to 5 minutes. But
there were 6 minutes.
But the purpose was the same, checking in. It's that touch point. For most people, there is nothing worse than not being connected. I'm thinking of quite literally, and this breaks my heart. So family friends living up in Michigan have been a part of a local congregation for a number of years, and they've been serving as the youth leaders. And 2 or 3 years ago, a new pastor came. And the last time I was home, I was hearing that the pastor, yes, you heard me say that correctly, who has been there now for 2 to 3 years, does not even know the name of the people who have been serving as the youth leaders. There's a disconnection there, folks. Now, that might be an extreme example, but imagine what would have happened if that same pastor had reached out to them and said, just checking in. Just want to thank you for what you've been doing with the youth. Anything that you need from me, anything that is happening. They're volunteers. Can you imagine what a different place that they would be? Because the place that they're at now is they're talking about leaving the church. Because there's a disconnection in relationship. That's where, again, I'm giving you an extreme example, but do you think that pastor intended to ignore them for 2 years and not know their name? No. But that's what happens when we're not intentional in building those relationships and building the connection that develops a culture of celebration.
You have a quick connection, but then as you develop that relationship, there comes a point too where you are being accountable for the ministry. So if you have made a quick connection with me in terms of those small groups that we're starting, there's another conversation to have that builds upon that.
Right. So those quick connections are happening each week, but on a monthly basis, you're really checking in. And this is where you're going back to the expectations that you set in that first meeting, and you're reviewing what the successes are and the challenges are, the barriers. And it might even be a time that you're going to have to realign and reset some goals because it's not going to happen. So again, continuing to play with the small group example, it might be a place that you say, we really thought that we were going to launch this by September 15th. But here are the things that have happened and what we need to tend to do this well. So can we push it back to October 1st? Because that will allow us to contact the youth. It'll allow us to contact the children and have all of that in working together so that when we unroll this, the parents of young kids, the parents of teenagers all know where they fit in and how this is working together. So that's going to happen in a monthly conversation. Again, you're continuing to go back to what you set up in that very first meeting. So that's the third one.
So what would be the fourth one?
So a couple of times a year, you're going to want to have what might be called a developmental conversation. This is where you're really giving direction and guidance that might lead to training or planning activities for folks, places where skills or capacity are not developed and need to be developed. It's also the place that you're celebrating what's working. So this is a place for feedback. It's a place for growth. It's a place to reflect back on, okay, Tim, we launched those small groups on October 1st. Let's look back to how that went And what notes do we need to make for when we do this the next quarter? Because we're going to keep on doing it. Checking in. Tim, do you still want to be a part of leading these small groups? Is this where you're still feeling your gifts and graces need to be serving? It might be that in that launching of those small groups, you encountered something very different that made you say, this has been good, but I really think that my gifts, I need to shift over to helping folks engage in serving in our community. Because part of what I'm seeing is I'm really good. I'm saying this because I know Tim is good at this. I'm really good at seeing all of the pieces and knowing where we need to go and getting them aligned so that we're heading in that direction. And there are always moving pieces when it comes to engaging in our community. And there's relationships that need to be built. And so that's really where I want to shift my focus. And so you're helping them to get to that place. That's the developmental conversation. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. What it reminds me of is when I was the pastor of a church in West Virginia. I, as the lead pastor, was the central person for making all hospital visits and all caring for people in nursing homes and extended care facilities. And what I did was recruit a group of people individually, and then we all sat down together and talked about how we could best give pastoral care to that congregation. I think there were 4 different areas where we needed to have people to give care. And as we defined each of those, let them choose where they would like to be. And then as I'm thinking about the developmental piece, people they chose for themselves where they wanted to be. I actually did the check-ins with them. I don't think I did it on a weekly basis, but I know we did it on a monthly basis, about how they were, what they needed to know. And when we got to this developmental conversation, was that there were people who said, I'd like to make hospital visits, but I don't know how. And so we spent some time talking about what would be good in a hospital visit and what would be good not to do in a hospital visit. So is that kind of what you're talking about in the midst of this?
Yes, and hearing you just say that, I'm chuckling, and so I'm just going to call myself out on something that I have not modeled well up until this point. I gave you a ministry from the beginning of this conversation around small groups. I could have said to you, Tim, what ministry, let's play with this a little bit. What ministry would you like to focus on? Hearing you give the example of congregational care and pastoral care is a perfect illustration of what happens in our local congregations. So I'm not going to go back and edit this episode and fix what I did, because I want you to hear how easy it is to do, to jump in and make an assumption about something that needs to be done. And folks, this is make believe. Tim's not starting small groups. I just grabbed that out of thin air. But I could have said, Tim, what's the ministry that you want to do? And if that wasn't bad enough, then I said we're going to shift it. And I picked something else again, and I didn't even say, Tim, what's the ministry? But what's the example that you offer? You offer pastoral care. And so stop and ask the question, because you're not going to be able to celebrate and help folks move through those different conversations if you don't stop and ask the question. So don't do what I did. even though it was a pretend ministry and just an example. Anyway, don't do that. Ask the question to begin with.
So, Sarah, if I'd been more sensitive, I would have told you about the church where I was, where we started small groups. And what I did was recruit a couple of people at the very beginning. who had a passion for small groups, and let them choose the team that they needed to have. And I actually did check in with them over a period of time on a weekly basis because I gave them some parameters. And when I would check in with them, they were telling me what they wanted to do differently than what I'd given them. And then I checked in with them on a regular basis, whether it was monthly or close to that time, to find out where we were so we could launch what we needed to do. And then the developmental question wasn't so much for the people who were helping get it started as it was about the people they had recruited then to be small group leaders,
right?
And how we needed to do the training then. So we'll take your example of what not to do, but yet if I'd been sensitive, we could have talked about small groups and what had taken place. Now, we've had 4 conversations. There is another one that's very important, and this is the 5th conversation and what we wanted to talk about.
Yeah, and this is what might be called the annual review, the celebrating the successes, preparing for the future achievements, and planning for that development and growth over the course of the next year. Now, when you get to this point, the dialogue here should have already been taking place in the other 4 conversations throughout the year. So all of that, those 5 conversations lead me to this question. Do you know how people want to be celebrated? Said differently, are you aware of people's potential and progress and how best to come alongside them so that you can celebrate what you see God is doing in their life and help them to continue growing to become the person that God has created them to be? So we have 8 questions we want to offer to you in terms of helping to know how people want to be celebrated and getting the information that you need as you develop the relationships with folks so that you can be the best leader that they need as they're continuing to serve in ministry. You can find those 8 questions on the show notes page at transformingmission.org/081.
Sarah, so what I would want us to remember is that different people see growth and development differently. So the value of celebration is a value of growth and development. It's about helping people to see and to be seen for who God created them to be and how their contribution matters to the church and, more importantly, to the kingdom of God.
So to conclude this episode, we will give you 2 questions. There's still 8 more that we want you to stop and think about. In the last 7 days, how have you celebrated the good work that you do? How have you celebrated what God's doing in and through you? Same question, said 2 different ways. And then the second question is, in the last 7 days, how have you celebrated the good work of others? Or how have you celebrated the way that God is working in and through the people around you?
There's a great need for courageous leaders who will take the risk to celebrate God's love and presence in tough times, and who take the time to celebrate the people God has given them to love and to serve. We're challenging you and coming alongside you to be the courageous leader that you can be for the people who need you.
And to take that next step, we invite you to sign up and participate in the Dare to Lead training, where you'll learn the skills you need to be a brave leader and create a courageous culture. It's just one way that we're helping you as a leader to transform your relationship with Christ, your congregation, and your local community. So before we sign off, let me ask you that question again. In the last week, how have you celebrated what God is doing in your life and in the lives of others? Then go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.